Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really big topic, the Federal Reserve, the Fed. We've gone through some, well, pretty fascinating audio excerpts trying to shed light on this really powerful, often kind of mysterious institution.
Yeah, it definitely has an air of mystery. Our goal here really is to unpack where the Fed came from, how it actually functions day to day, and, touch on the big debates swirling around it. We want to cut through the noise, the jargon, all that stuff.
I'd get to the core issues,
Yeah.
exactly. And we're using audio that features a host talking with G. Edward Griffin. He wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island, and also Mark Calabria from the Cato Institute. So for you listening, if you're curious about what's really going on behind the scenes with our economy, stick with us. The mission is to get a solid handle on the Fed fast.
Okay, so where does the story usually begin? The official one, I mean.
Right. The official narrative, like what you might find on the Fed's own website, often tries to trace its roots way back to Alexander Hamilton and the first Bank of the United States, 1791.
Sounds pretty legitimate, right? Historical precedent.
Yeah, but here's where our sources immediately throw up a flag. A reality check. Because, okay, yes, there were the first and second banks of the U.S., they were early tries at central banking.
But they weren't the Fed, and they didn't last, did they?
No, their charters failed after about 20 years each. There were huge public worries back then about, too much financial power in one place. So those banks aren't really direct ancestors in the way it's sometimes presented.
Okay, so the official story kind of skips over that bit or glosses it and jumps ahead.
Pretty much. It usually lands on the financial panic of 1907. That's often framed as the big crisis, the thing that proved we needed some kind of central financial reform, the catalyst.
But the audio we looked at paints a, let's say, different picture of the Fed's conception. Much more secretive.
Oh, definitely. The core ideas, the blueprint for the Fed, were apparently hammered out in total secrecy at a meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia, back in 1910.
Jekyll Island. Sounds dramatic. And who was actually there? Because that seems pretty important.
It is. The guest list was, well, basically a roll call of the financial elite of the time. You had Senator Nelson Aldrich, he was tight with J.P. Morgan, and actually his daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr.
Wow, okay. That's some serious connection right there.
And that's just one guy. Also there, Abram Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, representing William Rockefeller. You had Henry Davison and Benjamin Strong, both J.P. Morgan guys, and Paul Warburg.
Warburg. From Kuhn, Loeb and Company, connected to the Rothschilds.
That's the one, according to the sources, yeah. Partner at Kuhn, Loeb, representing Rothschild interests.
So let's just pause on that. This small group of men, meeting in secret, what kind of financial clout are we talking about?
Get this. The sources estimate that together, they represented something like 1/4 of the entire world's wealth at that time.
1/4. In one room, designing a banking system.
Yeah. It's pretty staggering, designing the system that would eventually affect pretty much everyone's money.
So what happened after Jekyll Island? Did their plan just sail through?
Not immediately. Their first draft, which was known as the Aldrich Bill, it actually failed. Didn't get enough support.
Ah, okay, so it needed some rebranding.
You could say that. It was reworked, repackaged, and came back as the Glass-Owen Bill. And that version is what President Woodrow Wilson signed into law in 1913. Officially creating the Federal Reserve System.
And the secrecy around that Jekyll Island meeting. Why was that so crucial, according to someone like Griffin?
Well, think about it. According to Griffin, the main reason for all the secrecy was pretty straightforward. If the American public found out that this bill, supposedly designed to protect them from the power of big bankers,
Was actually written by the big bankers themselves.
exactly, it likely would have been dead on arrival, the optics would have been terrible, public outcry would have been immense.
Okay, that makes sense. So if public protection wasn't the only goal, or maybe not even the main one, what were the motivations, according to the perspectives in the audio we heard?
Well, Griffin lays out a few key ones. First was apparently about stifling competition. You had newer, smaller banks popping up, starting to challenge the dominance of the big established players.
So consolidation of power. Keep the little guys down.
Seems to be part of the argument, yeah. And then there was this other huge incentive, getting what they called a franchise.
A franchise, like McDonald's.
Huh? Not quite. More like a government-sanctioned license to, effectively, create money out of nothing for lending purposes. This ties into fractional reserve banking, right? Where banks lend out way more than they actually hold in deposits.
Right, they leveraged the deposits so the Fed would formalize and control that ability on a massive scale.
That seems to be the idea presented. And alongside that, gaining control over the reserves of all the banks in the system, centralizing that control.
Which gives them enormous leverage over the entire financial system.
Huge leverage. And then there's this point, which is pretty critical in Griffin's analysis, the ability to shift the risk. If things go bad, if banks make bad bets,
Instead of the bank owners taking the hit.
the losses could potentially be shifted onto the taxpayers. That's the argument made.
Which, yeah, doesn't exactly scream public protection, does it?
Not really. So the story told to Congress, the public narrative, was all about stability and protection. But underneath, according to these sources, the motives were more about control, profit, and risk management for the banks themselves.
And the Fed started out
Oh,
with a big pile of gold.
nope. According to the audio host, it started with basically zero capital, just a checkbook. It gave the government a way to get funds without having to go directly to the taxpayers and ask for more taxes.
So the analogy used in the source material, comparing the Fed to something like OPEC, the oil cartel.
Yeah, a kind of money cartel.
Right.
Controlling the supply and price of money, working in partnership with the government. It's a powerful image.
Okay, so let's dig into the structure then. How is this thing actually put together? Because it sounds a bit confusing.
It is a bit unusual, yeah. Structurally, it's set up sort of like a network of private corporations. There are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and the member banks in their regions actually hold stock in their regional Fed bank.
Stock. So private banks own pieces of the Fed.
In a way, yes. They own stock in their regional Fed bank. But then the whole system was created by an act of Congress. And it has a public mandate, right?
Yeah.
To serve the public interest, maintain stability, manage inflation, maximize employment.
And the Fed's own website says it's owned by the citizens of the United States.
Right. Which, as the host in the audio points out, sounds good, but it's not like you or I can just walk in and demand our share or vote on interest rates. It highlights this weird tension between the public face and the mechanics of its structure.
So it's not really private ownership like a normal company, but it's not straightforward government ownership either.
Exactly. It's this hybrid thing. And adding to that, the employees who work at these 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, they aren't actually considered government employees. They're paid by their specific regional bank.
Which probably contributes to the feeling of opacity, right? A lack of transparency.
Definitely. It makes it hard for the public or even Congress sometimes to really get a clear look at their books, understand exactly who owns what, who benefits how. That lack of transparency is a major point of criticism in the sources.
And what about leadership? The people at the top, the board of governors. Who picks them?
The president appoints them and the Senate confirms them. But the audio mentioned that the Fed itself reportedly provides a list of candidates.
So that could potentially limit the president's actual choices, suggests a degree of independence or maybe insulation from direct political control.
Yeah, it raises questions about accountability for sure. Which brings us to the impact this whole system has on the economy, specifically these recurring boom and bust cycles.
Right. The audio laid out this pretty sobering timeline of financial crashes in the U.S., going way back 1837, 1880s, 1890s, 1907, obviously, then 1929, the Great Depression, 1937, 38, 46, 62, 87. It's a long list.
It really is. And the big question hanging over it is, how much are these crises linked to the Fed's own policies?
Well, Mark Calabria in the source audio definitely draws a line. He points specifically to the aftermath of the dot-com bust around 2000, 2001.
What did the Fed do then?
They cut interest rates dramatically to historic lows and kept them there for quite a while.
Trying to stimulate the economy, presumably.
Yeah, trying to avoid a deep recession after the tech bubble burst. But Calabria argues that those super low rates basically just inflated the next bubble.
The housing bubble.
Exactly. That long period of cheap money encouraged a lot of borrowing, a lot of speculation in the housing market. It fueled the frenzy until the Fed started raising rates again around 2006. And then, well, we all know what happened next. The bubble burst spectacularly.
So the argument is the Fed's attempt to smooth out one bust actually sowed the seeds for the next bigger bust.
That's the narrative presented. And the worry expressed now in the audio is that we might be seeing a repeat performance. With all the quantitative easing QE, basically pumping money into the system and interest rates kept near zero for so long after the 2008 crisis.
Are we just inflating another massive money bubble?
That's the concern. It feels like this cycle of trying to fix the last crash by creating the conditions for the next one.
If you look back even further, before the Fed, the audio mentions J.P. Morgan, how he actually, personally bailed out the U.S. government during panics in the 1890s and 1907.
Right, and that story is often used as the justification, you see. We can't rely on one rich guy, we need a formal institution. That's the historical argument for the Fed.
But Griffin offers a much sharper critique, doesn't he, calling the whole system potentially something like a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, that's a strong term he uses. His argument is that a system based on money created out of nothing, not backed by anything tangible like gold, requires constant expansion. The money supply has to keep growing.
And when it stops growing, or contracts.
Boom turns to bust. Inevitably, in his view, it's inherently unstable when money isn't anchored to something real.
Which leads to the whole Fort Knox situation, the gold reserves. Is there doubt about what's actually there?
Well, the audio brings up reports that even members of Congress have supposedly been denied access to do a full, independent audit of the gold at Fort Knox.
Really? Denied access.
That's what's claimed in the source. Whether it's true or just rumor, the fact that the question even exists fuels suspicion. What's really backing the dollar if we can't even verify the gold?
And Calabria adds another layer, pointing out that the biggest stash of gold isn't even Fort Knox anymore.
Right. It's held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And a huge chunk of that gold doesn't even belong to the U.S. It belongs to other countries, stored there for safekeeping.
So it raises pretty fundamental questions about the dollar's backing and stability. Now, talking about the Fed, it's easy to wander off into, well, the audio called it crazy town, conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and that's a really important point the sources make. There are so many wild theories out there about the Fed, involving secret societies, nefarious global plots, lizard people, whatever.
Stuff that's easy to dismiss.
Exactly, and the danger is that the existence of those really out there theories can be used to discredit any criticism of the Fed, even the legitimate fact-based ones.
Kind of like poisoning the well. If you question the Fed, you must be one of those crazy conspiracy theorists.
Precisely. It shuts down discussion. Griffin mentions that maybe in the past, reliable information was harder to come by, which might have fueled speculation. But he argues there's more factual data available now.
Still, the secrecy doesn't help, does it?
Not at all. And think about this. The audio brings up Alan Greenspan, former Fed chair, admitting he didn't fully understand some of the complex financial derivatives that blew up in 2008.
If the head of the Fed didn't grasp the risks, it does make you wonder about oversight, doesn't it?
It raises serious questions about competence and control within such a crucial institution. That inherent secrecy, combined with moments like that, it just feeds distrust and speculation. It makes people wonder what's really going on.
And according to the perspectives in the audio, maybe the real game isn't just about the bankers getting personally rich.
Right. The suggestion, particularly from Griffin, is that for some, the ultimate goal might be bigger than just money. It's about converting that financial power into political power.
Influence on a national, maybe even global scale. That New World Order idea sometimes comes up in these discussions.
Yeah, that phrase is often loaded, but the core idea presented is about seeking broader control. And the strategy, according to Griffin, isn't necessarily direct control over everyone.
How does it work then?
It's about targeting what he calls the power centers of society. Think political parties, big labor unions, major church organizations, influential media outlets, universities, foundations.
Okay, the key institutions.
Right. The idea is you don't need to control all the members. You just need to influence the leadership at the very top of these organizations.
Get your people, or people sympathetic to your goals, into those key positions.
Exactly. Influence the leadership, and you can then shape the policies and direction of those organizations, which in turn influences society more broadly. It's presented as a more subtle, top-down approach to gaining control.
History does show some pushback against central banking power, though. The audio mentioned Reagan.
Yeah, apparently Reagan had some friction with the Fed, pushed back on regulation early on, reappointed Volcker, but then disagreed with him later. And there were reports, according to the source, of the Fed maybe vetoing some of Reagan's preferred hard money candidates for regional Fed boards.
Interesting. And way back, President Andrew Jackson famously fought against the second bank of the United States.
He did. A major battle. And the head of the bank back then, Nicholas Biddle, basically threatened to crash the economy to force Jackson's hand. It shows how these institutions can wield their power when challenged.
Okay, let's talk mechanics. How does the Fed actually create money? The audio mentioned the Mondry mechanism.
Right, the Mondry mechanism is the term used in the source, essentially referring to the technical processes the Fed uses. Think open market operations, buying and selling government bonds.
So when they buy bonds?
They essentially pay for them by crediting the seller's bank account with new digital money, money that didn't exist before. Poof, it's created electronically. That injects money into the system.
And when they sell bonds, it pulls money out.
Exactly. The buyer pays the Fed, and that money is effectively removed from circulation. That's the core way they expand or contract the money supply.
The audio also brought up Ben Bernanke, the Fed chair during the 2008 crisis, denying that the Fed was monetizing the debt.
Yeah, that phrase means basically printing money specifically to finance government spending. Bernanke denied doing it, but critics in the audio argue that the massive QE programs looked an awful lot like it, even if the mechanics were slightly different.
And it's important to remember it's not usually about physically printing piles of cash,
Yeah.
right?
Mostly not, no. It's primarily done electronically these days, just creating digital dollars in accounts. But the effect on the money supply is the same. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services potentially leads to inflation.
Okay, so turning to right now, the current economic outlook. The audio seemed pretty cautious, maybe even pessimistic.
Yeah, the phrase real tough time was used. There's a definite concern raised about the possibility of stagflation.
Stagflation, that's like the worst of both worlds, right? High inflation and high unemployment.
Exactly. Like the U.S. experienced in the 1970s, it's really difficult to deal with because the usual tools to fight inflation, like raising interest rates, tend to slow the economy and worsen unemployment. And tools to boost employment can fuel inflation.
And the audio casts some doubt on the official inflation numbers, too.
Yeah, there is skepticism. The argument being that the official Consumer Price Index, CPI, might not capture the true picture. Some point to alternative measures, like the rising price of gold, suggesting actual inflation could be much higher than reported. So the Fed's in a tough spot now, trying to curb this inflation. Very tough. They need to pull money out of the system or at least stop injecting so much. The main way to do that is by raising interest rates significantly.
But that risks triggering a recession, right? Slowing down the economy too much.
That's the huge risk. The audio mentioned the early 1980s when Fed Chair Paul Volcker jacked up interest rates really high to break the back of inflation. It worked eventually, but it caused a very deep and painful recession first.
So what does all this mean for, regular people, especially younger folks just starting out?
Well, the advice offered in the audio was interesting. Focus on building what they called human capital.
Skills, knowledge, experience.
Exactly, because your ability to work, your skills, your expertise, that will always have value, regardless of what's happening with inflation or the currency. Labor is always needed.
And for protecting wealth you already have during inflation.
The suggestion was to look towards tangible assets. Things like silver, gold, maybe even stockpiling food, owning land, physical things that tend to hold their value better than paper money when inflation is high.
Because inflation just eats away at savings, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Even a seemingly low inflation rate, say 2 or 3%, compounds over time and significantly erodes the purchasing power of your money if it's just sitting in a savings account. Savers get hurt.
This leads back to the gold standard debate, then.
It does. The point made was that up until 1971, when Nixon took the U.S. off the international gold standard completely, there was at least some kind of anchor for the dollar. It put a limit on how much money could be created.
So going back to gold or some kind of commodity backing could theoretically restrain the Fed.
That's the argument made by proponents. It would impose discipline, limit their ability to just create money at will, make the system more stable, less prone to inflation and these wild booms and busts.
And apparently there are moves happening at the state level.
Yeah, that was interesting. The audio mentioned a bill in North Carolina looking at a state-based currency possibly backed by gold and silver, and a law already passed in Utah that recognizes gold and silver coins as legal tender alongside U.S. dollars.
So maybe change doesn't have to come from the top down, from D.C. States could lead.
It's a possibility raised in the sources that maybe monetary reform could start bubbling up from the state level, or even from individuals choosing to use alternative forms of money.
Which ties into the final thought presented, about individual awareness and action perhaps being part of the solution.
Yeah, I think this whole deep dive, pulling from these different sources, gives you a much clearer foundation. You've heard about the Fed's contested origins, its unique structure, the motivations debated, its impact on economic cycles, the controversies.
It's a complex picture for sure. But hopefully, you listening now have a better framework for understanding this incredibly powerful institution and the critical discussions around it.
So the final question we leave you with, thinking about these cycles, the current situation, the potential for change, What role will you play? How will you navigate this? Because understanding the system, as we've explored today, is really just step one.